Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going back and we're going to look at yet another myth associated with George Washington. In a previous episode, we looked at the myth of George Washington's wooden dentures. And this time we're looking at a myth about George Washington that's probably much more well known, and that is the myth of the cherry tree. And Chris, when we think about myths about George Washington, this one, it hangs on for dear life.
You know, what's interesting about history and things you didn't know about history is that regardless of your fascination about history or whether you like it or you don't like it, you think it's just a bunch of names, dates, and events. And, you know, why do I need to study it? The really cool thing about history is the storytelling of history. Everybody loves a good story. We love a good story through a movie, a good story through a book, even a good story in the form of music, of a ballad that is being sung. And I think even in history, that there are stories that we hear and we don't really think about the veracity of truth that comes from it, but we think about it being a good story and it sticks with us. And those stories are meant to entertain, but those stories can also be to remind. And I think the story we have today is one that entertains, but it also reminds us of some very important principles that we need to put into our own lives as well.
Yeah, and I think we have to go back and we have to look at the man who actually came up with the cherry tree story. His name was Mason Locke Weems, and he was a minister. And I think a large part of the reason he came up with that story was, number one, in 1800, Washington died on December 14, 1799. And in 1800, people are wanting to know more about the first president of the United States. They're wanting to know more about the hero of the American Revolution. And people like Weems are perfectly happy to give them more, help sell a book maybe. But also, I think with Weems, it's also, Chris, about virtue. Showing people that George Washington, at least in his mind, was an example of virtue and how people needed to be. And Washington was an example of what people needed to follow in their lives. So the cherry tree story definitely fits that context of, well, I've got to come up with a story that makes Washington look like somebody people can model themselves after. And what a better way to do that than to have this story where Washington is apparently disobedient to his parent, his father in this case, but then is submissive, respectful, and apologetic for his behavior.
I look at it in the 2022 lens, and I see that what Weems was trying to do is he was trying to portray Washington as an influencer. That's that big word that's out there today, is the young people look towards people who will influence. They'll influence you to buy a product. They influence you to dress a certain way, to listen to a certain, music or song or movie. And I think you have to, the greatest American in history up to 1800 has just passed away. And America is kind of on the precipice of, where do we go from here? I mean, no disrespect to the incoming president number 2, but there's a big change that's coming. And if you have a book that says, yes, you've heard of Washington on the battlefield, you've heard of Washington in Congressional Hall, you've heard of Washington as president, but have you heard of Washington as a child? Because honestly, right, we don't talk about his childhood. We don't talk about his teenage years. We talk about the man, the legend. And so Weems gives us a myth, a story, but maybe just a glimpse into the person of Washington and how you and I and others can learn lessons, as you mentioned, of virtue, of leadership, but also how to live life.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of what Weems was trying to do, was to provide people with, this model that they could follow. Now, it is interesting that this particular story only appears, I think, in like the 5th edition of Weems' book, but that's fine because everything we've said thus far still holds true. You know, he's coming up with this myth about Washington and the cherry tree to, I guess, like I said already several times, to demonstrate, like you said, something about Washington's life and also something people can follow. And I think, Chris, we do need to say a little bit about the content of the story. And as the story was originally told by Pearson Weems, Washington is 6 years old and his father gives him a hatchet. Now, you know, in 2022, Chris, I don't know about you, but you probably didn't give your 6-year-old son a hatchet for their birthday.
No, and I don't remember even getting a hatchet at all. I mean, you know,
closest thing I ever got to that was literally a Red Ryder BB gun, but you know, that's not a hatchet.
No, but that sure is dangerous in your hands.
It was dangerous in my hands. It was very dangerous. Like the movie said, you'll shoot your eye out, kid. I didn't do that, but it's only a miracle that I didn't. But you know, he's 6 years old. He gets his hatchet, according to the story. He gets this hatchet from his father. And again, we need to take ourselves back to the early 18th century. You know, this is a guy who's living in a rural part of Virginia. You know, something like a hatchet, it's going to be valuable to George Washington as he grows up. So he gets this hatchet, and apparently his father is gone somewhere, and he comes back only to discover that little George Washington has damaged his tree or cut down his precious cherry tree that the father apparently likes. And when confronted, George Washington replies, "I cannot tell a lie. I cut it with my hatchet." So Washington is immediately submissive to his father. He's immediately apologetic and sorry for what he's done. And you see this scene where George Washington's father was happy and jubilant about his son's honesty.
And how his son's honesty was worth more than 1,000 of those beautiful cherry trees. Yeah. You know, I mean, and you have to, I mean, we go back to that context. George Washington didn't stay inside and play PlayStation. He went outside, he explored, he journeyed. I mean, it's kind of like when you and I were growing up and we played outside, and when you heard the bell ring or you heard your mama call you, that's when you came in, but we explored. And Washington explored. We got to keep in mind also he's 6 years old. Now he knew that was a precious cherry tree. I mean, looking at the story aspect, right? And, you know, it's a beautiful cherry tree and it means something to his dad. And I am quite confident, knowing George Washington running around the house quite a bit and things like that, Dad had probably told him at some point, "Son, that's a special tree. That's a pretty tree. Don't touch that tree. Don't cut that tree down. Don't do anything with that tree." Even when he got the hatchet, he was probably told, "Have fun with it, but don't mess with the tree." So there's lessons here, you know, about father-son relationships or parent-child relationship, but also what we know we shouldn't do, and yet we still do. So I do go back to this thing that Weems is painting moral lessons out of this, of how we are to live as a nation, how we're to live as colonies, as we're to live as communities, and also how we are to live as individuals.
Yes, and it's almost like a moral parable. You know, you think of the New Testament and you think of the parables Jesus gave. You know, you don't press those parables for historical accuracy. They're a story meant to teach a lesson. And you almost see in Weems doing the same thing. So the question is he lying, or is he telling a parable about Washington? You know, he's telling a parable with an actual historical figure. And I think you said something there a minute ago, Chris, that brought to my mind something. You were talking about the relationship between fathers and sons. Well, you know, a lot is not really known about George Washington's relationship with his father. Washington's father dies when George Washington's about 10 years old. So, you know, he doesn't live long enough to see Washington grow up and to become president of the United States and all this other stuff. So what was Washington's relationship with his father? What was that relationship like? we have quite a bit about what Washington thought about his mother and some of the things that went on with his mother Mary. But as far as what went on with his father, there's not much there. So this moral parable, I'll call it, sort of fills in those blanks a little bit. It sort of tells us a little bit about what may have been the relationship between toddler George Washington and his father.
And once again, there's meaning in this to help both the moral and religious reforms in American society here. And I think the best way to do that, I go back once again, I know we're throwing so many anecdotes out here, but the old phrase, I want to be like Mike, that whole, I want to be like Michael Jordan. I want to, well, I think Reams is here saying, I want to be like George. I want to be like George, who is honest. I want to be like George, who is truthful. But also, I think there's something to be said about the story, about the way that the dad responded.
Right.
That this is not it's fine, whatever. Dad was ticked off. Mm-hmm. And dad actually confronted him. And dad got mad because, so I think, the story is, look, it's okay to be disappointed. It's how you handle that disappointment, and here we are. Things are going to happen in America that you're not going to like. You're not going to appreciate. But don't go and do something that could destroy the moral fabric of society by using a hatchet and tearing up the Constitution, tearing up the halls of justice, really destroying the fabric of society just because you don't like something and you get mad about it. That there's a right way to handle injustice. There's a right way to handle wrong. There's a right way to handle when someone does you wrong and they take something that is very valuable. Oh my gosh, how deep does this story get? It's not just tearing down or chopping down a cherry tree, but it is reminding us that your cherry tree is going to get messed up. But how do you respond to that? And how, if you're the one who messes up the cherry tree, are you willing to just be honest and say, you know what, I screwed up. I messed up. So Ray, I don't like that it's called a myth. I don't like that, maybe a fable, a parable. I like that word that you also use, because I think that it could be an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It could be an earthly story with a very rich meaning. And I don't think we need to discount it like, that myth, that story never happened. That's not real. Okay, it's a story, but it's got great meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely does. That's awesome what you just said. I have never viewed this parable in that way, about, how you respond, not just simply to personal situations, but to national situations. That's very interesting. And it reflects, I think, what Pearson Weems and others thought about virtue, the importance of good virtue and having good character. And, earlier in the podcast episode here, I said that this is one of these myths that just keeps hanging on. It just won't. And I know you said you don't like the term myth, but the story, let's say the story of Washington Cherry Tree, just won't go away. It keeps coming up. And it wasn't just Pearson Weems. There was a guy, he was a Presbyterian minister, so here we have this, again, this idea of using this as a parable, a moral parable, a virtue parable. He was also a college professor. His name was William Holmes McGuffey. And William Holmes McGuffey wrote McGuffey Readers to help children, of course, learn to read and that kind of thing. And this thing was first published in 1836, sold over 120 million copies in about 100 years. And the story is repeated in there. You just think the number of people, Chris, over 100 years who were influenced by this reader and learned the lessons maybe of virtue and honesty that George Washington in the story showed, and the deference to his father. In fact, in this particular version, Washington is a little more formal in the way he addresses his father. He says, "Father, do I ever tell lies?" It's a more formal type presentation of the story. But you know what? Like you said, it goes back to this idea of a parable that's teaching people lessons that they can use in their daily life. And what better way to do it than in a grammar book?
And I might be sharing a myth. I don't remember where I got it from just years ago in my studies, but I believe that I recalled that Abraham Lincoln read this story. It was like one of the first stories he read when he was teaching himself how to read. And you just kind of have to think about the parallels there, right? That here is Abraham Lincoln, who has, by gracious, one of the biggest decisions to make, one of the ways to have to handle people who feel that they have been harmed and hurt, and trying to unite two opposite groups. It would be interesting if that was the case, that as a 6-year-old, Abraham Lincoln picked this book up and he started to read the story. But not only was he reading the story as a story, but he was reading it as something that would, here you go once again, it wouldn't go away. The story shouldn't go away. The story should always be part of our lives, because whether it's true or not, once again, there's value in it. There's meaning in it. And so here's Lincoln years down the road, who goes back when he's handling, how do I help a fractured nation? He goes back and he says, at the end of the day, South, I'm mad at you and I am ticked off at you and I can't stand what you've done. But what does he do? He's always trying to find a way, parable, to allow the wayward son, to allow the troubled son to possibly come back. Just something to think through.
Yeah, you think of Lincoln's second inaugural speech, and the wording he used there. I think the phrase was, what was it? It was like, "Ooh, I shouldn't have done that."
With malice towards none.
With malice toward none. Thank you for saving me there, Chris. I am not going to edit that out. With malice toward none, I think you see that in Lincoln's second inaugural address. And something I did not know when I was researching the cherry tree story. Something I did not know was there's a connection here to the great P.T. Barnum, the circus person. He had a slave by the name of Joyce Heath. And this slave was in his show, of course, and she was supposedly raised by George Washington, or she's not raised by George Washington, but she supposedly raised George Washington. Now, there was no chance in the world that this was true. While the woman was old at this particular point in time in her life, she wasn't nearly old enough to have raised George Washington. But she apparently, in the stories she would tell, I guess as part of the show, the cherry tree story was one of the stories she told about George Washington. So you just see so many ways this story gets into the American consciousness, whether it's through Weems or McGuffey or the P.T. Barnum thing. This story just keeps finding its way into the American consciousness over and over again, and it's endured for over 200 years now.
And once again, isn't it fascinating that this all comes from, what'd you say, like a children's reader? Is that, that this early grammar book that was teaching kids how to read and to understand grammar was also really teaching them how to live. But also, as the story was orally told, it was also reminding the nation of the leadership of Washington and how that was developed from an early age. Many people might look at Washington as a soldier and as a leader and eventually as a president and think that he just walked in and he filled the shoes. But he didn't do that. He lived a very difficult life, full of tragedy along with success. He had people that loved him. He had people that detested him. But I think that in everything that he did, there's very little you can really go hard on about George Washington. There's a few issues where he really, struggled with. But at the end of the day, I think that the story being a story, but I still think that it showed his virtue. It showed his willingness to love all people, to be honest to all people, even if you don't like what he's got to say. He was honest about it. And there's a lesson there, I think, for 2022, even though this was written years and years ago. What was the year? 1800?
1800, yeah. I think now we sort of switch gears a little bit. And Chris, I want to sort of balance things out here a little bit, because we've talked about the story by Weems. We've talked about, moral parable and virtue, but we need to ask the question, did George Washington always live up to this standard? Did George Washington always live up to the standard that's presented in this parable? And the answer, of course, is no. No human being could ever, I don't think, look at someone and honestly say, I never tell a lie, because, we're all going to fib at some point, right?
And he was a politician.
Yeah, he is a politician. But George Washington, of course, one of the areas in George Washington's life that I think is probably the most open for criticism is, of course, his involvement in slavery, in holding human beings in bondage. He inherited his first slaves when his father died, of course, like I said, when he was about 10 years old. And he held slaves for the rest of his life until he died in December of 1799. There's an incident that occurs while he's president of the United States, and the capital has moved from New York to Philadelphia. And back in 1780, Pennsylvania passed the so-called Gradual Abolition Act. And the purpose of this act was basically the state was trying to get rid of slavery. And instead of doing it in one fatal sweep, they were sort of gradually trying to get rid of slavery, as the title of the act says, the Gradual Abolition Act. Now, part of the act said that if a slave was in the state more than 6 months, they would automatically be emancipated, that is, be freed. So Washington is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, as president of the United States. He's living there, and he has his slaves with him. And Houston, we got a problem, because he doesn't want these slaves to be freed that way. Now, one could argue that these were part of the custos dowry. These are part of the family slaves that, if they run away, or if he had freed them, he would have to pay to replace them. He would have to pay the estate to replace them. And that's certainly a possibility. But it's interesting what Washington does. He takes these slaves, and every 6 months or so, he comes up with a reason to send them back to Mount Vernon in Virginia. He comes up with a reason to take them out of state. And every single time he did that, Chris, the clock reset. So he could send Ona Judge or Hercules or another one of his slaves to Mount Vernon, and they would go and come back maybe in a few weeks or few months. And that 6-month clock started over every single time he did that. And what's so disturbing about the story is that he did it, but at the same time, these people found out what he was doing. Ona Judge found out. And right before Washington's about to leave the presidency, she runs away. She gets out because she finds out she's basically going to be going back to Mount Vernon, and she's going to be given off to one of Martha's daughters, and she's not up for this. So she just secretly and quietly leaves. And she's never captured again. Now, Washington does find her, but she's never captured and brought back to slavery. So I think that shows, Chris, another side of Washington. Whereas, yes, he was generally a virtuous and honest man, but at the same time, like every single one of us, like you, like me, like everybody who's listening, he had his so-called dark side, I guess you could say. He had that side that, yes, he talks about how he doesn't want to purchase another slave. He's not going to sell a slave. and all this kind of thing. But then you see this behavior where he's going out of his way to prevent his slaves from being free.
So it's this cosmic struggle.
Yeah.
And is it that what Weems really wanted to do was to show that George Washington wasn't perfect?
Yep.
He wasn't this, robot who just always did right, but that Washington struggled and he made mistakes. And I think that was the original goal. Yes, moral reform. Yes, religious reform. Yes, all of these other things. But at the end of the day, it was also to remind us that life is difficult. Choices have to be made. And at the end of the day, we have to choose to make the right ones. And I think that was the thing with Washington. You did a great job with that story, and you showed the human side of him and the struggle that he had. And I remember one of the quotes from Washington about this whole being honest thing. And that quote that he said was, quote, "I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man. More than being a president, more than being the commander in chief, more than being a husband, more than even being a father. It's about being honest and recognizing that we make mistakes and we atone for those mistakes and we always try to do better." So I appreciate that about Washington. And I wish that we would spend more time talking about the stories that you just mentioned about Washington so that we can balance it out, so we don't put him on a pedestal. And I mean, I know you love him and I know that he's number one, in your book.
He's number one in more than a few ways.
Yeah. But the reason that he's number one, I think, is because he was a great leader, but he also made some big mistakes.
Yeah.
And how do we learn from that? And how do we go forward?
But you think about it, Chris, if he didn't make those big mistakes, he wouldn't be human.
He wouldn't be human. Yeah. And guess what? If you and I didn't make mistakes, we wouldn't be where we are today.
Yeah.
We learn from our mistakes. We grow from our mistakes, and mistakes stink and they are really, really bad. But they do, if we choose to use them to guide us, they just might make us better people, which means that we could have a better community, a better society, a better nation. And just maybe if we would listen to the old myth, we might even have a better world.
I don't think I could put a better ending on this particular podcast episode than that, Chris. I hope our listeners enjoyed this episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. As always, if you have podcast ideas, topic ideas, please send them our way. You can email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Twitter. You can always leave feedback there as well. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we'll talk to you later.